On a cold May morning in 1536, the Tower of London wasn't just a prison, it was a stage for the most shocking judicial murder in British history. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had torn the church apart and rewritten the laws of God and man, sat in a small room waiting to die. She wasn't just a queen who had fallen out of favor, she was a political problem that needed to be erased. The crowd gathered outside, not just to witness an execution, but to watch the brutal dismantling of a woman who had dared to reach for the sun. Henry VIII didn't just want to divorce her, he wanted to annihilate her legitimacy, her reputation, and her very existence to clear the path for a new wife who was already waiting in the wings. The air was thick with the tension of a kingdom holding its breath, knowing that the sword was about to fall, not on a criminal, but on the mother of the future. For 500 years, we have asked if she was guilty. But the real question isn't about adultery or incest, it's about power. Anne dared to play a game designed for men, and for a brief, shining moment, she won. She believed her intelligence could protect her, but she forgot that in the Tudor court, the rules can change in a heartbeat. She had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of the court, but now the tide had turned violently against her, sweeping away her allies one by one. Her confidence was her armor, but it was also the target painted on her back, inviting the arrows of every jealous courtier who couldn't stand a woman with a voice. But before the sword could swing, we have to understand the storm that brought her here. How did an outsider with no royal blood capture a king so completely that he burned down his own religion to have her? Anne wasn't your typical English rose. Raised in the courts of France, she came back to England with a sharpness and sophistication that made other women look dull. She didn't simper, she debated. She didn't submit, she challenged. When Henry VIII, trapped in a loveless marriage, turned his eyes toward her, she did the unthinkable. She said no. Her French education had taught her that a woman's greatest asset was not her beauty, but her ability to keep men guessing and wanting more. She refused to be a mistress, a decision that drove the king to the brink of madness and forced him to dismantle the spiritual foundations of his own country. For 7 years, she held him at bay, demanding nothing less than the crown itself. It was the most expensive courtship in history. To get Anne, Henry broke with the Pope, appointed himself head of the church, and divorced a Spanish princess. It was a geopolitical earthquake, triggered by one woman's refusal to settle for second best. Monasteries were dissolved and centuries of tradition were uprooted, all to satisfy one man's obsession with a woman who promised him everything. She wasn't just a lover, she was the architect of a revolution. A catalyst that transformed England from a Catholic stronghold into a Protestant island. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Anne had promised Henry a son, a male heir to secure the Tudor line. When she delivered a daughter, Elizabeth, the love that had moved mountains began to turn into a cold, deadly resentment. The failure to produce a son wasn't just a marital issue, it was a breach of contract. In Henry's eyes, Anne had failed her primary purpose. The passion that once burned for her curdled into hatred. And waiting in the shadows was Jane Seymour, quiet, submissive, everything Anne was not. Every time Henry looked at his daughter Elizabeth, he didn't see a future queen. He saw a divine punishment for his marital rebellion. Henry looked at Anne and saw only his own mistakes, a reminder of the chaos he had unleashed for a prize that had failed to deliver. The wolves at court, led by the ruthless Thomas Cromwell, smelled blood. Cromwell didn't just want Anne gone, he wanted her destroyed. He fabricated a monstrous conspiracy, accusing the queen of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. These weren't just lies. They were nuclear bombs designed to obliterate her reputation forever. He gathered musicians, servants, and courtiers, bullying them into signing false confessions that would serve as the nails in Anne's coffin. Incest, treason, witchcraft. They threw every dark label they could find at her, knowing that the truth didn't matter as long as the king wanted her dead. The trial was a farce, a piece of theater where the verdict was written before the jury even sat down. But even as the walls closed in, Anne refused to crumble. On the 15th of May, 1536, she stood before a court of her peers, men who had once bowed to her and defended herself with a clarity that shamed her accusers. She denied every charge, picking apart their flimsy evidence with the sharp intellect that had made her queen. But it didn't matter. She answered every question with a sharp wit that exposed the absurdity of the charges, yet she knew the judges were deaf to her logic. The king wanted a new wife, and in a tyranny, the king's desire is the only law that counts. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a twisted act of mercy, commuted the sentence to beheading. But he didn't order the clumsy axe used for commoners. He sent for a specialist, a swordsman from Calais, who could take a head with a single clean stroke. He wanted her dead, but he also wanted to preserve the image of himself as a benevolent monarch, even while signing her death warrant. It was a final, grotesque gesture of care from the man murdering her, ensuring her beauty wouldn't be mangled by a butcher's tool. Days before the verdict was even delivered, the swordsman was already on his way. Her fate had been sealed in ink long before the trial began. Now, all that was left was the walk to the scaffold. On the morning of May 19th, Anne dressed for her final public appearance. She chose a gray damask gown with a crimson petticoat red, the color of martyrdom. She walked to the scaffold not with fear, but with the regal dignity of a woman who knew history was watching. The heavy fabric of her gown rustled against the stone, a sound that would linger in the memories of the witnesses long after the cannons had fired. She joked with the constable of the tower about her little neck, a flash of dark humor that showed her spirit was unbroken. Witnesses described her looking back, smiling, as if she knew something they didn't. Standing before the silent crowd, she gave a masterclass in final speeches. She didn't scream her innocence. She didn't curse the king. Instead, she prayed for him, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord. By refusing to attack the king publicly, she ensured that her family would retain their titles and property after she was gone. It was a calculated move to protect her daughter, Elizabeth, from the king's wrath, a final act of sacrifice from a mother who knew her death was the price for her child's safety. She knelt in the straw, declining a blindfold until the very last moment. She kept her eyes open, murmuring prayers, her lips moving in a silent rhythm. The crowd held its breath. The swordsman, knowing that the anticipation was torture, asked for his sword to be handed to him, a trick, as he had hidden it in the straw to distract her. Anne turned her head toward the sound, exposing her neck perfectly. In that split second, the blade flashed. It was a psychological mercy for the victim, but a calculated piece of theater for the onlookers who watched in morbid fascination. There was no hacking, no struggle, just a sudden, violent separation of the woman from the legend. The cannons at the tower fired, not in mourning, but as a signal to Henry that he was finally single. While her body was bundled into an old arrow chest because no one had bothered to order a coffin, Henry was already riding to marry Jane Seymour. He thought he had erased Anne Boleyn. He thought he had buried his mistake. The speed with which he moved on was the final insult, erasing years of passion in a single day of indifferent celebration. He believed that by cutting off her head, he had cut off her influence, leaving her as nothing more than a cautionary tale for unruly women. But he was wrong. You can kill a queen, but you cannot kill a legacy. The daughter Anne left behind, the useless girl Henry ignored, was Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I would become England's greatest monarch, the Virgin Queen who ushered in a golden age. She wore her mother's necklace, a silent reminder of the woman who died to give her life. Anne's ghost haunted the Tudor dynasty not as a specter of guilt, but as the mother of its greatest triumph. The Virgin Queen would rule for 45 years, turning the small island nation into a global superpower that eclipsed her father's reign. Every victory Elizabeth won, every enemy she defeated, was a posthumous vindication of the mother who had been discarded like trash. Anne Boleyn wasn't a victim. She was a player who lost a high-stakes game, but won the long war of history. She challenged the world order, and though it killed her, it also immortalized her. By refusing to go quietly into the night, she ensured that her name would be whispered with a mix of awe and fear for centuries to come. She proved that a woman's power doesn't come from her husband, but from her own indomitable spirit, a truth that terrified the men of her time. History belongs to those who carve their names into it, even if they have to use their own blood as ink. If Anne's story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Join us as we uncover more of history's darkest secrets. Until next time, remember, the truth is often sharper than a sword.